Good evening, friends. So nice to see so many of you attending the World Mission Institute, sponsored by Catholic Theological Union, Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, and McCormick Theological Seminary for 52 long years. Yeah. Thank you. This is the first time we have lots of people coming in person. And more than people that are in person, we have a number of people attending through the technology. This is very exciting. And I would like to quickly recognize the organizers of these World Mission Institute at this point in time. So may I invite all of them to stand for a minute, please? Shall we all give a big hand to their work? Thank you. We are also graced by the presence of CTU President and McCormick and LSTC deans. We want to say a very warm welcome to them. Thank you for joining us. You all are special to us, and thank you once again for joining us. And before I invite Dean Pensinger to welcome us formally, we have a small moment to remember. As many of you may not know, about 52 years ago, two of our former professors had this vision of organizing the World Mission Institute with the goal of informing our seminary communities. What is the current missiological thinking and what God is calling us to do? It is to that end we thought about care for the creation to be this year's theme. And it so happened two of our founders left us just last year. So I thought it may be appropriate that we all stand for a moment by paying our tribute to them. Dr. Jim Scherer and Dr. John Boberg. Dr. John Boberg is a CTU professor, and Dr. Jim Scherer is an LSTC professor. May I invite you all for stand movement if you're able. Kindly take your seat. Thank you. I would also like to recognize the presence of Dr. Jim Scherer's daughter, Dr. Susan Scherer, and Dr. Scherer's beloved wife, Leanne, in our midst. And they would like to present a gift to all of our three schools. So I'm going to invite Dr. Susan Scherer to come and invite Dr. Linda Thomas, the Dean of LSTC, to receive the gift from her. Please.
It is really nice to see all you friendly faces and to be in a new seminary environment. I grew up in the Maywood Seminary campus environment and then was very close to the LSTC on 55th Street. Anyway, so this was an item that was amongst my parents' belongings. And it's a painting entitled Lutheran Catholic Vesper Service, commemorating the 500th birthday of Martin Luther, Holy Name Cathedral, Chicago, November 30th, 1983. So, and I took a picture of what was printed on the back, but I can't find the image now, so I'll send it later. I'd like you to receive that on behalf of the ecumenical community. Thank you very much.
We are going to take a moment remembering these two great founders of World Mission Institute. I'm going to invite first Dr. Steve Evans to come and say a few words of remembrance about Dr. James Sherr, followed by Dr. Roger Schrader, who would bring some thought to us about Dr. John Fulbert. Steve, please.
Good evening, everyone. It's a real privilege this evening to offer a short tribute to Professor James A. Sherr, who, together with my former professor and Roger's former professor, Jack Boberg, founded the Chicago World Mission Institute in, at least by our reckoning, 1971. This evening, we look back in gratitude on a 53-year-old ecumenical venture that has been an important event in our school's calendars, and I think has been a model of Christian fellowship, friendship, and scholarship, now in its 6th decade. I first heard of Jim Sherr when I was in college, when I happened to see a copy of his book, very important in the context of the 1960s, entitled Missionary Go Home, with an exclamation point. When I joined the faculty of CTU over 20 years later, I was delighted to know that Jim would be a colleague, and eventually he became a fellow editor of 3 books, and I became a friend to him and his late wife, Frances, and also now his widow, Leanne. She, of course, is here with us this evening, together with Susan, Jim's daughter. Jim was a giant in mission studies. He had a rich experience both in China in the 1940s and Japan in the 1950s. He completed his doctorate at Union Theological Seminary in New York under the legendary Chicago professor Pierce Beaver and the legendary and very controversial Johannes Hoekendijk, who was at that time professor at Union. He was a founding member of the American Society of Missiology in 1972, and in 2012 received from that society its Lifetime Achievement Award. Jim's life and scholarship was rooted in faith and zeal for mission. And that faith and zeal was shared with countless students over the years, especially his many LSTC students who completed the PhD under his direction. I believe, Peter, you are one of the many. Jim was a noble soul, a gentle soul. He was a marvelous friend and colleague. And we celebrate his legacy this evening with deep gratitude for his quiet commitment to LSTC and his vision for mission, made concrete for so many years in this World Mission Institute. Thank you.
Next slide. There we are. Good. So I'm going to speak about Dr. John, or Jack Boberg, as most of us called him. Jack Boberg was an SVD priest. He co-founded the World Mission Institute together with Dr. James Sherr. Jack completed his doctorate in missiology at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome in 1962. His doctoral thesis was on the catechist in the missions, with a focus on the catechist system in Vietnam, which was started by Alexander de Rhodes, so a very famous catechist system. So that was his doctoral thesis, published in '69. He was professor of missiology at the SVD Seminary in Technion, Illinois in 1968 and 1970. And then he came to CTU in 1970 and taught here until 1982. He co-edited with Jim Sherr this book, Mission in the 70s, What Direction? And these were the talks given during the first World Mission Institute in 1971. I just found this, I did a little research yesterday in the library, and I found a copy of this book. So this was the institute at that time was sponsored by the Chicago Cluster of Theological Schools. This goes back in our history in that way, and held in 1971. Copy of the book. And it's interesting, as I was reading this, the first World Mission Institute was spread out over 10 days. Then we cut it back to 2.5 days, and then to 1.5, and now we're down to this evening, as time has changed. It was very interesting to see the speakers that they had here is really something else. In the 70s, the big names that they had who came here at that time. Jack left the SVDs in 1982. He got married to Jerry Darsney, who worked in our CTU library for many years in that way. On a personal note, Jack was the one who in 1979 encouraged me and convinced me, I was an SVD new priest at that time, convinced me to study missiology. I was going to go back to Papua New Guinea, and that's where I wanted to be a bush missionary, but he convinced me to study missiology. So after I returned from New Guinea, I then went to the same university he did, the Gregorian University in Rome, and that's where I got my doctorate degree there as well. So Jack was my mentor, so it's really touching for me to remember him also on this day. The two of them, he died 7 months ago, Jim more recently, of course. So he collaborated with James Sherr on the World Mission Institute and many other mission efforts. Jack died September 9th, 2023. And I visited Jack and his wife since 1990. Every year I'd go down and visit them wherever they were living. So a personal friend. So I'm very glad that we could honor both of them tonight, these two men together. Okay. Good. I now would like to invite Dr. Annette Hessinger to come forward to lead us in an opening prayer.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome on behalf of President David Crawford, President of McCormick Theological Seminary, who could not be here with us tonight. So I am his stand-in for that particular this particular role. I hope that you've already sensed the welcome that is evident in our community here, maybe through the meal, then through the fellowship around our tables, prior to the gathering here in this room. And also the welcome of this building, this space, which CTU has made extremely welcoming to the Lutheran School of Theology, Chicago, and to McCormick Theological Seminary. It's a wonderful experience to have this big atrium space where we can hear and see and just be aware of other people who are working in theology, who are studying, who are laughing, who are enjoying their time and growing together in the peace and justice of God. So welcome to each of you, and welcome to those of you who are online with us. And if you haven't already, we hope that you will find this building and this space and be able to enjoy that kind of welcome that the building embraces you when you walk in. I'd like to ask a blessing as a prayer. I'm going to read part of a blessing by John O'Donohue from his book, To Bless the Space Between Us. You might like to consider this a prayer. Let us bless the imagination of the earth that knew early the patience to harness the mind of time. waited for the seas to warm, ready to welcome the emergence of things dreaming of voyaging among the stillness of land. Let us thank the earth that offers ground for home and holds our feet firm to walk in space open to infinite galaxies. Let us salute the silence and certainties of mountains, the wonder of a garden trusting the first warmth of spring, the humility of the earth, the kindness of the earth, opening to receive our worn forms into the final stillness. Let us ask forgiveness of the earth for all our sins against her, for our violence and poisonings of her beauty. Let us remember within us the ancient clay, holding the memory of seasons, the passion of the wind, the fluency of water, the warmth of fire, the quiver touch of the sun, and shadowed sureness of the moon. That we may awaken to live to the full the dream of the earth, who chose us to emerge incarnate in its hidden night, in mind, spirit, and light. And I ask that the Spirit of God would bring this blessing not only to the earth, but also to us as we consider these words this evening, and we continue to learn and to grow together. Amen.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Van Tang Nguyen, Professor of New Testament Studies at Catholic Theological Union. I also hold the Bishop Francis Ford Marino Chair of Catholic Missiology. And it's really a privilege and honor for me to introduce our keynote speaker this evening. The Reverend Dr. Barbara R. Rossing is Professor of New Testament at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, where she has taught since 1994. That's 30 years of dedicated service. Barbara holds a doctorate from Harvard University Divinity School and a Master's of Divinity degree from Yale University Divinity School. She is an ordained minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and has served as pastor at numerous congregations. Barbara's areas of expertise cover a wide range of issues and topics, including the New Testament, apocalypse, ecology, peace and justice, Revelation, sexuality, eschatology, just to name a few. What really stands out for me about Barbara is that she loves to teach and preach about the Bible, including the Bible's role in public life, where she has made an indelible mark. As a public theologian, her media appearances have included CBS 60 Minutes, as well as the History Channel, National Geographic, Living the Questions, and numerous print and radio interviews. Barbara is also an avid environmentalist. Barbara has lectured and preached widely, including Synod assemblies and global mission events for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, known as ELCA, as well as ecumenical theological conferences. Her most notable book publications include The Rapture Exposed, The Message of Hope in the Book of Revelation, The Choice Between Two Cities, For Bride and Empire in the Apocalypse, and numerous articles and book chapters on the apocalypse and ecology. I would like to quote something Barbara wrote in her chapter entitled "For the Healing of the World, Reading Revelation Ecologically," found it in this edited volume from Every People and Nation, the book of Revelation in Intercultural Perspective, edited by David Rhodes. And it's an article that I've used and assigned my students to read when I teach the book of Revelation. Some of them are very familiar with Barbara's work. This is what Barbara wrote in the introduction of this article. Quote, "Ecological interests are what first drew me to study Revelation. I had always been an avid hiker and naturalist, and I majored in geology in college. When it came time to pick a doctoral dissertation topic, I assumed that ecological interests could not be linked to biblical studies. What do you love in the New Testament? My professor Helmut Koester asked me. You must write about what you love. I told him that what I loved was ecology and God's care for the earth, but that I did not expect to find that in the Bible." End quote. This was a big surprise for Barbara, and the rest is history, as they say. Without further ado, please join me in welcome our keynote speaker, the Reverend Dr. Barbara R. Russing. Wow.
Okay, that's embarrassing that I didn't think there was ecology in the Bible. So my title is Kairos for Creation, Kairos for Mission, Hope for Our Common Home. Obviously a line there, the common home from Pope Francis's Laudato Si, the really important encyclical that came out just before the Paris Climate Accords. Last week, the city of Chicago announced a lawsuit against 5 fossil fuel companies, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, BP, ExxonMobil, Phillips 66, and Shell, alleging that they intentionally misled the public despite longstanding knowledge of the climate dangers of oil and gas. Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson cites the wildfire smoke last summer. Remember, all over the United States, it was just choking from the Canadian wildfires, as well as basement floodings that residents on the west side of Chicago have experienced it. And then also going way back to 1995, the more than 700 people who died during that heat wave. And I remember that. My neighbor across the street was one of those. And of course, now we might add things like the tornadoes that touched down in February in Illinois. And then of course, the wildfire in Texas, the biggest ever. And then wildfires in Australia and so much more, all worsened by climate change. Chicago's lawsuit joins other cities and other local governments accusing fossil fuel companies of a deliberate campaign of deception. Exposing a campaign of deliberate deception, that's one link I'm going to make to the Bible tonight, to the apocalyptic book of Revelation. It turns out there's not just ecology in it, but there's a lawsuit against oppressors by the elements of nature, the waters. What Revelation does is unmask the Roman Empire's deception by sort of pulling back a curtain. That's what the word apocalypse means, pulling back a curtain to expose the true nature of things. I like to say somewhat like the dog Toto in Wizard of Oz. You know, when Oz is so terrible and intimidating, it's Toto who goes over and pulls back the curtain to expose that he's just a bald guy from Kansas pulling levers. So John of Patmos exposes the empire system as a deceiver of the whole world and calls the Roman Empire a monstrous dragon. I picked up my dragon plate tonight at dinner. We're in the year of the dragon, so I'm not sure how I'm going to use this plate. But anyway, when I was at Standing Rock in 2016 with Jose David, one of the things that the people in Standing Rock did was expose the oil pipeline as a dangerous dragon snaking across the landscape. But we have to wait a minute for the deception and the dragon. First, my primary focus is Kairos. the biblical term for an urgent and opportune moment. In 1985, South African church leaders issued the Kairos document as a daring prophetic word against apartheid, invoking the biblical sense of Kairos, including the apocalyptic book of Revelation, to critique the ways the violent system of apartheid was being justified biblically. The Kairos document cited chapter 13 of the book of Revelation to counter the government's use of Paul's Romans 13. Here, John of Patmos critiques the Roman Empire as a dragon, as a beast, quote, when the state becomes the servant of the dragon, the devil, and takes on the appearance of a horrible beast, its days are numbered, because God will not permit this unfaithful servant to reign forever. With that prophetic announcement, the Kairos document made a daring and a political critique that also is eschatological. That just as John of Patmos identified the Roman Empire of his time as a satanic beast whose duration was limited and short, so too the apartheid system's days were numbered. In the years since 1985, the Kairos document has continued to shape biblical hermeneutics of liberation. The term Kairos is now evoked in other contexts, importantly, around the world where people cry out for justice, whether by Palestinians living under Israeli occupation, whether by Canadians working to oppose tar sand extraction and support Indigenous rights in the Kairos Canada organization. The South African document with its notion of Kairos has helped to give our world a much needed vocabulary. We are in a Kairos moment today. A Kairos for the climate crisis. My church, the ELCA, named it last year in its new climate message, and Kairos is a term the Greek Orthodox Patriarch Bartholomew has used since 2007. As you mentioned, I was a geology major in college in the 1970s, and we used mnemonics to memorize the sequences of geological ages and epochs of Earth's 4.5 billion years of history. Yes, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. The universe is 13 billion years. So come over someday, maybe play poker was the way to remember. I'm going to try to do my heart here. Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, and Permian. Those are the eras making up the Paleozoic. The Mississippian and Pennsylvanian are sometimes combined to be called the Carboniferous. And that's the time span when all the fossil, not all, but most of the fossil fuel layers, coal, oil, shale, and gas were laid down from the anaerobic decay of plants on land and marine plants over the course of 50 million years. And I love, since the 70s, studied more of this geology and the history of the atmosphere with our Zygon Center for Religion and Science with Gail Wolosek. I had no idea how the atmosphere has evolved. It was so toxic at one time, and now it's really perfectly calibrated for mammals, for life, for the whole biosphere. It's that thin blue line that astronauts see from space that they call so beautiful, so beautiful. In terms of the biblical story of God's creation of this amazing planet Earth and its atmosphere, we might say that God was safely sequestering the carbon out of the atmosphere through plants, taking it down and into those layers, which have now become rock, so that the Earth could become such a safe temperature for life. I mean, it's not intentional, obviously, but this perfectly calibrated atmosphere we have, we owe to the fact that most of our carbon is stored underground. Unlike planet Venus, our nearest neighbor that has the same amount of carbon, is a twin in terms of our size, but is way too hot for life because Venus's carbon is in the atmosphere. And some say that should be a scary warning of what can happen with runaway CO2, but we won't get to that point. Okay, so that was come over someday, maybe play poker. Then at the end of the Paleozoic era was marked by the Permian extinction. And after that, our mnemonic for the Mesozoic and Cenozoic era. The Mesozoic is the era of the dinosaurs, and Cenozoic is mammals. This was 3 jacks cover 2 queens. You get the poker theme here, right? Okay. So that was Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, Tertiary, and Quaternary. And within the Quaternary, you've got the Pleistocene and the Holocene, our present epoch, which started about 12,000 years ago after the end of glaciation. That's what I learned in college in the 1970s. But scientists tell us now that in the past 50 years or so, or perhaps a little longer, the first detonation of nuclear weapons in 1945, you can see that in the rock layers, or perhaps the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, you can see that also fueled by coal and fossil fuel burning. The world has now exited the Holocene and entered an entirely new geological epoch, post-Holocene, that can only be called the Anthropocene, signaling that the greatest impact on Earth now is caused by humans, the anthropoi, and our industrial production. Or some call our epoch the Plasticine, because we're learning now how dangerous plastics are and they stick around forever. Or some call it the Capitalocene. That's Jörg Riegert, for example, theologian, who points out that 100 corporations are responsible for 71% of all fossil fuel emissions. The Capitalocene. Whatever you call it, this epoch is sobering. Our world is ill with a fever, like Peter's mother-in-law in the Gospel of Mark, like the little daughter who is at the point of death when the father says to Jesus, my daughter is at the eschatos. Come and lay your hands on her and heal her. We need healing. If we don't turn our economy fast, we risk possible irreversible tipping points, possibly leading to a sixth mass extinction. And it's not just the climate system at risk, it's biodiversity, it's all living systems, it's the ocean system, river systems, coral reefs, aquifers, all the waters of life. They're all in mortal danger. As journalist Dar Jamail, author of a book, The End of Ice, describes, quote, Earth has a severe fever and the global industrial society built on growth, extraction, and colonialism is the cause. So our moment truly is a kairos. It's about eschatology. And why this matters for the World Mission Institute, and I'm so glad you chose this topic of creation care, is that already climate instability is causing global wars and conflict and migration. The Syrian civil war, people think, can be attributed to climate change. And the cruelest injustice is also one that concerns us as people working on global mission. The consequences of climate change will fall most heavily on the most vulnerable people. Island nations, indigenous communities, subsistence farmers in Africa and Latin America and other places whose crops are already devastated by droughts, women and girls who have to walk farther and farther to bring water, migrants, the poorest people of the world, and future generations. Climate change is a cruel crisis, and it's the largest public health crisis we've faced as a species. Vector-borne diseases such as Zika, cholera, malaria, and much worse are on their way. And I hadn't even heard of chikungunya. And there's another one coming up this way. So the diseases are terrible. And then there's the world's food crisis. There's a conference coming up at Loyola in a couple of weeks about climate and world food crisis. And then, of course, so many other great programs from Faith in Place and other organizations. All things are connected here. So what we have to say is if we care about God's mission in the world, and thanks to the founders of this World Mission Institute, we must care about the climate in this Kairos moment. The good news is, and I'm here to deliver good news, is that our best scientists, that is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change authors, tell us that we are in a critical decade right now, the 2020s. What we do in this decade matters for the next thousands of years. So say Christina Figueres and Tom Rivett-Carnac in this book, The Future We Choose, and these were some of the architects of the Paris Climate Agreement. So says, I'm reading this book, I just love this book, Not Too Late. I had it out of the library and it's so good, I bought it. Not Too Late, Changing the Climate Story from Despair to Possibility, edited by Rebecca Solnit and Thelma Young Lutanunabua. And it's got all kinds of hope stories in here. But the good news from one of the climate scientists in here, Joelle Gurgis, who's the author of one of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change chapters, she says, you are living through the most profound moment in human history. That is right now, this decade. They tell us, and this is also our probably top climate scientist, Michael Mann, others such as Catherine Hayhoe, there's time to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. There's a definite pathway to safety. That is by the year 2030, in order to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is what the world's countries have agreed to. We need to have made a rapid transition to clean energy. We need to have reduced emissions of heat trapping gas from fossil fuel burning by half. And by 2050, we need to reach net zero. And they say we can do it. That's the real good news in some of these chapters. There's the CEO of an organization called the Solutions Project. It turns out the path doesn't even have to be difficult. Who knew? Because renewable energy now is the cheapest form of energy there is, and breakthroughs have been happening so much faster than anybody expected. It's not just wishful thinking. The CEO of the International Energy Agency says solar is the cheapest energy in history. Its cost has dropped by more than 90%. So too for the cost of batteries, heat pumps, induction stoves, and everything we need. So it's not really about sacrifice, which is what, we used to preach when we said, put on a sweater, turn down the thermostat. It's about innovation. It's about making a transformation. It's about abundance, and we can do it. Policymakers show that there is a pathway. It's basically electrify everything and generate that electricity renewable. It's a narrow but very achievable pathway. But the problem is, it's being blocked by the deceivers, by fossil fuel companies and others who try to convince us that it's too late and we must despair. So our moment is a Kairos moment, a hopeful, opportune moment in time. That's how Jesus uses the word Kairos. In 2007, the Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew used the term at the conclusion of an Arctic Symposium journey in Greenland, seeing the melting ice of the Greenland ice sheet and meeting with indigenous church leaders and civic leaders, with artists, with everyone. Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew warned that the time is short for the world to take decisive action on climate change. And here are his words from 2007, quote, "As individuals, we are often conscious of a Kairos, a moment when we make a choice that will affect our whole lives. For the human race as a whole, there is now a Kairos, a decisive time in our relationship with God's creation. We will either act in time to protect life on earth from the worst consequences of human folly, or we will fail to act." And then he ended with a prayer. May God grant us the wisdom to act in time. Well, of course, that was 17 years ago. So did God grant us the wisdom to act in time? Apparently not. If 2007 was so urgent, does that mean it's too late now? And what I want to say tonight is no. Kairos can be a very helpful term, but the risk with Kairos as an environmental wake-up call can be that it seems to imply that there will come a time when it will be too late to do anything. Now, interestingly, the book of Revelation has what one scholar calls a kind of rolling sense of delay. So it's never too late. There's always time for repentance and for turning. And that's what I want to say tonight. We need to say it's both a Kairos moment. It's late, but it's not too late. For one thing, climate change is not like a cliff that you fall off, that, once you've fallen off, it's too late. As Kate Marvel, climate scientist, says, it's more like a steepening slope that we slide down. Things will keep getting worse and worse, hotter and hotter, until we take action to stop the burning of ancient carbon that's been sequestered in those rock layers, until we start to listen to nature and draw on nature's properties to re-sequester carbon. And then, if we temporarily overshoot the recommended temperatures by the year 2050, even so, the temperature can stabilize and come back down. Our current level of carbon dioxide is 420 parts per million. I mean, I remember when we crossed 400 and it was like so shocking that we did that. The Industrial Revolution, prior to that, it was 280 parts per million. Already we see climate chaos in things like, well, your lack of winter in the Midwest, erosion of indigenous villages in Alaska because the sea ice does not form, and then these wildfires and floods, so much. But what we have to say is 500 parts per million will be a lot worse than 400. So let's start acting now. It's not too late. Unfortunately, the message of too late is what we do sometimes hear from cynics, from alarmists, from doomers, and even sometimes from young people who are so concerned that their parents' generation frittered away this incredible 30 years. But too late can become just another form of climate denial. Both denial and despair lead to inaction. And that's the claim that Imran Ahmed, CEO and founder of the Center for Countering Digital Hate, makes. He calls despair the new climate denial. He analyzed the messaging and funding of hundreds of YouTube sites and websites about the climate, saying things aren't so bad. And he reveals that they're funded by the fossil fuel companies. Quote, instead of flat out denying climate change, oil industry funding voices now go on YouTube and other digital platforms to spread the false message that action now won't make any difference. It's too late. And unfortunately, I was looking at an Associated Press article from last year. Now, most Americans seem to have at least accepted that message partly. Most now do blame climate change for extreme weather. 8 in 10 say they've personally experienced extreme weather caused by climate change, but few people feel motivated to do anything. They feel anxiety and sadness, but they don't feel there's much they as individuals can do. So that's what we have to change. This is our task, to say and act. It's not too late. The church's mission at this Kairos moment needs to be to figure out how to open up the space between, on the one hand, denial, and on the other hand, despair, and say, this is our space for bold prophetic action. This is our space for hope, for transforming our economy very fast, like in the book of Jonah, that funny parable about where the people of Nineveh pivoted in just 40 days. And it started with grassroots action. The people took to the streets and leaders changed because of them. We already have all the technology we need to make that pivot really fast, maybe not just 40 days, but fast. And what we lack now is the political will on the part of the leaders. We need to get in the streets, the grassroots action, and change leaders and turn this thing around. So as a biblical scholar working on Revelation, yeah, I'm still working on it 30 years later. I'm going to turn to Revelation for a few ways I think the book of Revelation can help us today. And my thesis is that that biblical term Kairos, which is in Revelation, and also the Kairos history as a social justice frame beginning in South Africa, can help us open up that space between denial and despair, a space for mission and transformation. What we need to be about is the subtitle of this book, Not Too Late. We need to change the climate story from despair to possibility. Okay, so Kairos, reading the signs of the times there when Jesus says it's Kairos. Jesus' first words in the Gospel of Mark proclaim Kairos. The Kairos is fulfilled. Or we might translate as Joanna Dewey does, time's up. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus uses Kairos, counseling people, can't you read the signs of the times? And that's something, I didn't know this, but the Vatican already in 1965, Anne Elvey points this out in her chapter on Kairos and climate in Luke 12. She quotes the Vatican Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. Quote, at all times, the church carries the responsibility of reading the signs of the time and of interpreting them in the light of the gospel. So that's what we're about. That's what Pope Francis is about in Laudato Si. Paul uses the word Kairos in Romans 8. I consider sufferings of this present Kairos are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed. And he says it's now time to wake up. That's the Kairos. Besides, you know what time it is, how it is the moment to wake from sleep. The book of Revelation uses Kairos 4 times. First of all, to tell the beast that his time is short. That's the line that was quoted in the Kairos statement. And then importantly in chapter 11, to declare that the Kairos has come, the time has come to destroy the destroyers of the earth. So that's a key fact. It's not to destroy the earth. We mistakenly think the book of Revelation is about destroying the earth. No, the time has come to destroy the destroyers of the earth, namely the Roman Empire and those who abuse the earth. Over against the Roman story of how the world works. And the empire had a story, claims propaganda like Roma Eterna, inscribed in monuments and on coins. Everybody was supposed to think that Rome was going to last forever. New Testament authors boldly proclaimed a counter story, declaring an imminent end to the empire. John of Patmos did that by retelling the Exodus story in his own time, scripting Rome as Egypt, scripting Jesus as the Lamb and as a new Moses, and he called on people to exit out of that imperial system. That's what we need to do now. A revolution of the imagination is how John Collins described the apocalyptic worldview Apocalypses empower radical witness and ethics by giving us a sacramental imagination, by taking us on a journey into the heart of God's vision for our world, pulling back the curtain so people can see deeply into how the world works, both the beauty of creation, that thin blue line, that wonderful atmosphere, and also to see the pathologies of empire that have to come to an end, that are experienced as plagues against creation. Apocalypses show us the throne of God, and then they take us back out into the world, into our lives with a vision transformed to join with victims of injustice, to live according to a different community vision. Apocalypses are not escapist, contrary to what some older scholars thought, but they're looking for renewal of the earth. They function as resistance literature, engaging historical crises of oppressive empires. They communicate their prophetic message not by logical proofs or step-by-step arguments, but by visionary journeys and pictures, creating what Elizabeth Schistler Fiorenza calls an alternative world of vision. They rebuild people's imaginations, Chilean scholar Pablo Richard underscores, and he worked during the Pinochet government in Chile. Apocalypses show us something we urgently need to see. So I'm going to suggest two ways that I think we can draw, especially on indigenous knowledge. And I know we're going to hear more from Joanna about that, but to read the book of Revelation in our time of climate crisis, two things. First of all, personhood for nature. The apocalypses reveal a living planet full of beauty and life, full of vibrant joy, and it can give us tools for interpreting our climate crisis, because the cosmology of Revelation and other apocalypses assumes a strong solidarity between humans and the natural world, between visible and invisible powers and spirits. Animals are described as having souls. That's the Greek word psyche in chapter 16, verse 3, and also chapter 8, verse 9. Harkening back to Genesis 1, the idea of nefesh hayah, the whole cosmos is alive, sings praise to God. 4 living creatures represent nature before God's throne, and they sing holy, holy, holy. Yes, animals talk and sing in Revelation, kind of like the movie Babe, you know, where all those farm animals are singing jingle bells. Living water in Revelation articulates the idea that the waters are alive. The whole world is alive and has its own living spirit. Indigenous knowledge can help us understand this apocalyptic notion that animals and nature have agency and spirits. They have personhood, if you will. And here I just want to quote my late colleague, Gordon Straw, a member of the Brotherhood Nation, whose inaugural lecture in the Cornelson Chair of Spiritual Formation at LSTC wove together strands of spirituality, including the indigenous metaphysics of a personal universe, encouraging us towards, quote, seeing the universe as living and personal rather than mechanical and objective. He quotes Vine Deloria's description of indigenous metaphysics. The best description is the realization that the world and all its possible experiences constitute a social reality, a fabric of life in which everything has the possibility of intimate, knowing relationships, because ultimately everything is related. Apocalyptic metaphysics is very similar. In Revelation, an ecosystem, water, is represented by an angelic messenger or guardian, its spirit. And other elements of nature also have angelic figures as guardians, including the angels who control the 4 winds in chapter 7, and an angel with authority over fire in chapter 14. The universe is alive. Walter Wink, a New Testament scholar, noted this already in his 1986 trilogy on the powers, that we in Western Christianity have sometimes overlooked the apocalyptic cosmology of spirit and angelic representation of nature. These sources have languished in the very heart of our own tradition, but now we need to retrieve the sense of personhood for nature. These are living spirits. Wink points it out that systems of evil and oppression also have corporate spirits, living spirits. And in Revelation, they are diagnosed as these multi-headed beasts, like the snake here at the pipeline. Satan is the world-encompassing spirit of the domination system. I think we have a couple slides of dragons in the book of Revelation. One is a modern one from the from a church in Switzerland, a wonderful tapestry. There it is, Notre Dame de Toute Grâce in Assisi, I think, in Switzerland. Anyway, the woman clothed with the sun here in chapter 12, and a dragon is going to try to eat her up. He doesn't look very scary over there on the left, but the next slide, I think, is a scarier dragon from a medieval manuscript. Anyway, I figured we could have some art here. What Revelation can do is help us expose and dethrone systemic systems of deception today, whether the fossil fuel companies, climate deniers, or whatever, because this idea that corporate evil has personhood is also very important. And what's so important in Revelation is to say that deceptive evil powers have already been defeated. In chapter 11, there's this war in heaven. I'm chapter 12, the war in heaven that has a deeply mythic character. The archangel Michael defeats all the foes. And the dragon is given all kinds of names, but basically his core name is Deceiver. The great dragon, that ancient serpent, that's Satan, the deceiver of the whole world, has been thrown down, Revelation says. He has been defeated by people, by us. We are named as those who conquer the beast in chapter 12. Quote, they, that is we, have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. What Revelation is saying is our testimony really matters. Pablo Richard said that, drawing on his experience during the Pinochet regime in Chile. Quote, testimony is not just any word, but a public word. Testimony always has the power to change history, he says. The word testimony is the Greek word martyria. It can also be translated as witness, which is what Brian Blunt does in his wonderful book, Can I Get a Witness? And he says Revelation is calling for a witness of active, nonviolent resistance to Rome's claims of lordship over human history. So that's what we need to do now, is give our active, nonviolent resistance for claims of fossil fuels lordship over history before it's too late. My final point is to explore the notion of legal personhood and a legal voice for the waters, because witness or testimony is a legal term used in courtrooms. I want to suggest that Revelation can take us one more step in our active nonviolent resistance today, namely a legal step, giving legal personhood to nature. And this is what Indigenous communities are advocating for all around the world. Maybe it could even help the city of Chicago's lawsuit against fossil fuel companies. I don't know. But the idea of legal personhood for rivers and bodies of water started in New Zealand with the Wanganui River Claims Settlement, granting legal personhood to the Te Awa Tapua River, recognized by New Zealand's Maori people and by the parliamentary government. Indigenous communities in Ecuador and Australia have likewise advocated for protecting watersheds by recognizing them as juridical persons. In December 2018, the White Earth Band of Ojibwe in Minnesota passed a tribal law establishing legal personhood for their wild rice growing in lakes, including the right to flourish, regenerate, and evolve. And in 2019, voters in the US city of Toledo, Ohio, granted legal personhood to Lake Erie, one of the Great Lakes. Maybe we can do it with Lake Michigan. They did it because in 2014, for a week, the city's 500,000 residents could not drink their water from Lake Erie, the source of their drinking water for some 11 million people. A toxic algal bloom caused by agricultural runoff and other sources had poisoned the city's drinking water. Seeking to codify legally enforceable rights, the Lake Erie Bill of Rights passed with 61% of the vote in Toledo. Now, of course, it was, shot down. But enacting, because in the US, we don't have that yet, legal personhood for nature. But in enacting this legislation, Toledo voters joined other municipalities and communities worldwide who grant similar rights to bodies of water as part of the rights of nature movement. In 1972, US Supreme Court Justice William Douglas argued this in a dissenting minority opinion that just as corporations have personhood and have for more than 100 years, so too the river is a living symbol of all the life it sustains and flourishes: fish, aquatic insects, water ouzels, I love those ouzels, otter, fisher, deer, elk, bear, and all other animals that are dependent on it or enjoyed for its It cites its sound, its life, the river as plaintive speaks for the ecological unit of life that it is part of. So he thought a river should be able to be a plaintiff in a lawsuit. A river should be able to have personhood. But of course, that was a minority opinion. Douglas did not succeed. United States law courts recognize corporations, but not yet watersheds, aquifers, wild rice, not yet. But Revelation would disagree. In Revelation and other biblical apocalypses, waters have a voice, including a legal voice as plaintiff or prosecutorial witness, bringing a lawsuit before God against their oppressors. And I see this in chapter 16, the destructive bowl plagues. When the third bowl is poured out and rivers and waters are turned to blood, the angel or the messenger of the waters interprets this through the logic of justice and legal consequences, a kind of boomerang-like effect caused by oppressors' own crimes coming back around on them. Quote, you are just in these judgments, O Holy One, for they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and you have given them blood to drink. It is axiomatic. That's how I would translate that. What's important is the waters have legal representation by a guardian angel or messenger who can pursue justice. They can cry out in resistance when they are being polluted, and God hears their lawsuit. And a personified altar shows this. Yes, altars talk in Revelation, not just animals singing jingle bells, but the altar talks and says, yes, O Lord God, the Almighty, your just judgments are true and just. And then there's a liturgy. Then there's a kind of liturgical refrain that Pablo Richards says is us, is the community participating at this point. The community is involved actively in the exodus that God is bringing about from the evil system, the Roman Empire. So those two things from Indigenous knowledge, I think, can really help us personhood and maybe even legal personhood. The world is made up of stories, says the poet Muriel Rukeyser. Stories are one of our superpowers, says Rebecca Solnit, one of the authors of Not Too Late and of so many other books about climate justice. We need to tell stories of how the transformation is happening now. It's not too late. We can tell Bible stories. We can tell the story of the defeat of the apartheid empire. We can tell stories of civil rights struggles and struggles for justice that have been successful. Here's one I didn't know about, but law students in the island nation of Vanuatu decided a couple of years ago to do something about climate. And it's written up in the Washington Post how a small island nation got the world's highest court to take on climate justice. People in Vanuatu got the United Nations International Court of Justice to issue an advisory ruling taking countries to task that don't meet their emissions commitments in the Paris Climate Accords, thanks to an Indigenous activist, Julian Agwan. And there's so many other stories like that. Just this past year, the Montana state lawsuit, who thought those kids would win? But because the Montana Constitution gives people a right to clean water and air, these young people in Montana scored a legal victory, a victory that gives hope for a federal lawsuit now filed by our Children's Trust, Juliana versus the United States of America. These law claims include the Bolt decision some 50 years ago that enforced treaty fishing rights for Native Americans in Washington state. And we can tell stories of how the church stood up at key moments on the side of marginalized people and won, and we can do it again. Here's a funny one to tell. Bill McKibben, he's the founder of 350.org, and now he's got a new organization for us old folks called Third Act that you can get involved with once you retire. Anyway, he has a picture of people in the Costco store in the cake department holding cakes decorated with slogans telling Citibank to get out of fossil fuel investment, or telling Costco to get out of Citibank. And this is really important, actually, that where you put your investments is really, really important. And Citibank is one of the worst funding fossil fuel pipelines and infrastructure. So there they are, these geezers in the cake department at Costco. Be funny with how you do this. Do street theater. I loved it how Occupy Wall Street had this giant golden calf paper mache thing, parading it down Wall Street as a reminder of the biblical story of the golden calf. Use prophetic imagination. Use everything, because what we need to do is galvanize that segment of the public, 8 out of 10 who apparently believe they've experienced climate change is real, but they might think it's too late to do anything. They might be in despair or denial. We don't know. So we have to open up that space for action. Speaking of Kairos, it was high school students in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America in a summer science program at Gustavus Adolphus College a few years ago that succeeded in getting the ELCA to put out a new social message on the climate. They wrote letters to bishops. They insisted, they got their voting members at the assemblies to vote for this. And now we have a new climate message that names the current moment as a Kairos moment and calls for serious advocacy and action. We can tell stories of successes. We must not lose heart. There is still time. It's not too late. Nature still needs legal recognition, but we know that nature has incredible regenerative powers. Powers to heal, to cool cities, to filter polluted water, to sequester carbon, all those rock layers. We don't need dangerous geoengineering solutions. We can listen to the land. We can transform forestry, regenerative agriculture, stop subsidizing fossil fuels, stop supporting it with your investments. Time is late, time is short, but it's not too late. Naomi Oreskes in her book Merchants of Doubt talks about how the fossil fuel companies deceived the publics for so many years. The city of Chicago is saying that now. But it's not too late to make the transformation. The book of Revelation puts us at a crossroads between Babylon and New Jerusalem. It gives us a choice. It gives us a vision for hope and healing. It calls us to come out of empire so that we can come into God's vision for our world, led by Jesus, God's Lamb, who lives us to springs of living water. The antiphonal liturgy at the end invites us all to come, everyone who thirsts, come and drink from God's living water, a gift without cost. Water is priceless. Water is life, as they said at Standing Rock. For Kairos today, the New Jerusalem vision at the end of Revelation is the most important, where God is dwelling not up in heaven, but with us on a renewed earth, with a living river flowing right through the center of the beautiful city. A tree whose fruit feeds the world 12 months of the year and whose leaves are for healing. That tree of life can heal us and our world, and we pray it will be in time. Thank you.
Wow, what a talk. Well, what a positive note. We don't need to despair. We can act now. We can transform the world we are living in. And please join me once again to express our thanks to Dr. Barbara Rossing for reminding us what we can do right now in our time. It is my honor to invite our good friend, Dr. Steve Evans, to moderate the panelists and introduce the panelists to us. Steve, please come. And may I also request the panelists to come and take your seats.
Thanks very much, Peter. I'll repeat your wow. It was fantastic. And we have now 3 panelists who I think will even take us deeper into our reflections for today. I am not going to go through long introductions, because on your program, you can turn over on the back and you can see their very impressive, short but impressive CVs. Joanne Doi, wonderful colleague with lots of experience in Indigenous ministry. Marvin Wickware, who is assistant professor at LSTC and involved in all sorts of intersecting realities, one of which, of course, is ecological justice and the care for creation. and a longtime good friend, Ted Hebert, who has, I think, been a real pioneer, particularly in the Old Testament, in terms of ecological thinking and the importance of nature in the Bible. Let's welcome all three of these wonderful panelists. Perhaps we could go in that order, Joanne and Marvin and then Ted. And I'm just going to sit down here, but I just want to look at you.
Can I use this up here? So Sam, my friend Sam back there. So this in many ways is really a meditation on hope that you've sparked in us. And as you were speaking, I thought I'm really bearing witness the privilege of having been among many Indigenous groups. So I think, and I promise Peter, this will not go more than 7 minutes. So it's really, and I'm a visual thinker, so we'll just go slowly, well, in 7 minutes, go through these images. So the Milky Way over Lake Titicaca, where I lived and served, had the privilege among the Aymara people. There are so many, because there's not a lot of light, there are so many dark spaces that they actually named them. And then I learned through astronomy that dark spaces birth new stars. So that's our first image of hope. You can go to the next. And the next is just an image of the earth as on the cross. And I think you covered that very well, you know, that the earth herself is in exile. And we're trying to go towards one earth community. So you can go to the next. So I just want to point out a movement, you know, that's happening, or movimiento. You mentioned Laudato Si, and then the Amazonian Synod, so that the earth has begun to be listened to. Indigenous knowledge is sought, you know, in collaborative environmental assessment projects, but also hand in hand with that has to go a truth and reconciliation process. We're partly in this problem because we suppress those voices and practices. So I just want to make reference to what's happening in Canada. But we'll go to the next page. And just the connection among climate change youth leaders. So this was Greta Thunberg. When we take a class here to South Dakota. We went in 2019 and she had just been there and she had crossed paths with Tokata Iron Eyes in Washington at a conference. And then she made an effort to get out to Red Cloud Indian School to speak to people there. And then also did something in Rapid City. So just to show that the crisscrossing of solidarity is a sign of hope. And then the next page is, I was just in Chiapas, Mexico, and just learned in 2014, they had this Congreso de la Madre Tierra, which is pastoral coordination of the Mother Earth. And we have pastoral coordinations for youth, for campesino leaders, for health, for human rights, and to actually have one for the earth blew me away when I was there. And there are 3 principal focus are spirituality, earth practices, and defense of the earth. And this is just a short quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer, who you probably are familiar with, braiding sweetgrass. She's a Potawatomi plant scientist. What if we could fashion a restoration plan that grew from understanding multiple meanings of land? Land as sustainer, as identity, as grocery store and pharmacy, as connection to our ancestors, as moral obligation, as sacred as self. Where did you go? There you are, which you've highlighted. And then these are just images. So this is in Chiapas, some of the spirituality, that's the Mayan altar, the 4 directions, and those colors are created by the colors of corn that is there. And then the next is the Aymara people, and the way they do their potato planting is only possible because they're on these steep andenes. What are those in English? Anyway. Terraces, yes, thank you. So they're able to grow like 500 flowers from 500 different types of potatoes, different varieties. Those 500 flowers are my brain and my flesh. So that's their identification with the land. And then the defense
Human rights and environment. So of course, the extractive industries in Peru are slowly corrupting the water sources of the Altiplano, the high plains, make it an inhospitable environment for people that have lived there for centuries. However, social protests by Aymara and Quechua indigenous peoples and allies are being criminalized. So the Human Rights and Environment Office, they received the 2018 Human Rights Award. So this is the team, and you'll notice the woman on the right, Yolanda. You can flip the next. Yeah, there you go. The woman on the right, especially with the bowler hat, that identifies her. If you go to the next slide, you see her. So they went to pick up this prize in Washington, and at the same time, there was a protest there for Standing Rock. So you see her again on the right there. She's able to participate in that. And so the water protectors, the Mini Wachona Standing Rock is everywhere, was the sense. And then, yeah, so the Standing Rock Sioux, this is just a quote from the founder of the Standing Rock Sioux camp. If we allow an oil company to dig through and destroy our histories, our ancestors, our hearts and souls as a people, is that not genocide? And if you can make out the print on the water tower, make America Native again. That's on the rosebud, although now it's not there anymore. And then just to look at this concept of buen vivir, suma causai, suma camaña, it's Quechua, Aymara in Spanish. It looks at these values of relationality, reciprocity, and connection, cooperation, complementarity, not accumulation, that Pachamama has a limit yet can sustain abundant life. She has the capacity to rebound and restore. And the interesting thing is this is being adopted, integrated into Ecuador's constitution and rights of nature, and adopted by Bolivia's constitution and the law of the rights of Mother Earth in Bolivia. And I also heard it mentioned while I was in Chiapas. So similar to the legal, oh, I think you went too quick. But that's okay, we're gonna go there now. So then the next picture, this is also from our, the course Roger and I take. This concept of Mitakuye Oyasin, which is Lakota, means all my relatives. Interculturally, all these different peoples, but also all my relatives is two-legged, four-legged, eight-legged, the land. So everything are your relatives. So what would that mean if we lived with our relatives in that way? And just this quick concept of bounded space. Well, I'm going to skip the, spirit guide set the bounds to live from to create a bioregion. So what if each community thought in terms of a bounded environment that needed to support the lives of the people within it? What if each community vowed to be self-sufficient in food and water? What if we simply lived in our bounded spaces? And then you can go to the next, Sam. So this is just, to me, an example. Good trouble for a healthy planet, these micro initiatives. So this is the St. James Church here and just not too far away. On a half an acre, which was the former footprint of the church building, Just Roots, who is actually the director, is a CTU alum, Sean. They're coordinating to create this Just Roots. You can go to the next slide. Just Roots St. James Community Farm. And half the food goes to the food pantry and the other half is community sustained agriculture, subscriptions. They grow food locally and sustainably that in places that are known as food deserts in the South Side. They do education, they build community. So in a way, it's a new way of being church, even though not everyone's of the same religion or denomination. And they also did, and they started this in 2020 during the pandemic. And in 2021, they did another one in Sauk Village with Grace United Church of Christ and Good Vibes. And I'm just going to end with two quotes. Okay. Despair is paralysis. It robs us of agency. It blinds us to our own power and the power of the earth. Environmental despair is a poison every bit as destructive as the methylated mercury in the bottom of Onondaga Lake. But how can we submit to despair while the land is saying help?
Restoration is a powerful antidote to despair. Restoration offers concrete means by which humans can once again enter into positive, creative relationship with a more than human world, meeting responsibilities that are simultaneously material and spiritual. It is not enough to grieve. It is not enough to just stop doing bad things. Each of us comes from people who were once indigenous. We can reclaim our membership in the cultures of gratitude that formed our old relationships with the living earth. Gratitude is a powerful antidote to Wendigo psychosis. A deep awareness of the gifts of the earth and of each other in medicine is medicine. It celebrates cultures of regenerative reciprocity, where wealth is understood to be having enough to share and riches are counted in mutually beneficial relationships. Besides, it makes us happy. Gratitude for all the earth has given us lends us courage to turn and face the Wendigo that stalks us, which is the dragon. So hopefully we can transform that dragon into the Lunar New Year dragon, which is a benevolent creature. So the very last image is this poster I just picked up. In Latin America, we often say, otro mundo es posible. We're always, another world is possible. But the indigenous peoples are saying, otro mundo ya existe. Another world already exists. And her name is First Nations, indigenous peoples. Her mother is the earth. Her father is the sun. Her house is the universe. From Chiapas, Mexico. Gracias, Chiapas. Thank you.
In my response, I want to highlight and respond to two aspects of Dr. Rossing's talk, which stood out to me and helped me to wrestle with what it means to treat this moment as a Kairos moment. I appreciate this assistance, as I certainly have a tendency to take a pessimistic perspective when it comes to humanity's impact on creation or capacity for change. Frankly, I regularly wonder if it wouldn't be best for us to just get out of the way, collectively passing on as so many other creatures have. All right, Eddie. And as I'll get to in a moment, there's something to that sense that we need to get out of the way. Nonetheless, Dr. Rossing has helped me to curb my pessimism just a little bit and commit to more constructive theological and ethical reflection. With that in mind, I want to thank Dr. Rossing for her talk, which represents for us only a brief encounter with a rich ministry of scholarship and public engagement. I want to thank Dr. Peter Vedanayagamoni as well for extending an invitation to me on behalf of the other organizers who stood up for us earlier. So I have this opportunity for reflection and I might hope repentance. Two things stood out to me in Dr. Rossing's talk. First, my attention was captured by the importance of affect in her remarks. Affect, as I'm using it, is a term that describes the space in which emotions, belief, and political action influence one another in ways that we don't always perceive. She spoke of despair at it being too late to do anything about climate change, alluded to the fear we may experience when confronted by apocalyptic realities, and gestured toward our capacity to experience deep affection, appreciation, and mutuality with non-human creatures like rivers and lakes. Those feelings, along with others, each promote and constrain certain types of action and belief. Feelings, in short, matter a great deal more than our academic training might lead us to acknowledge, and I appreciate Dr. Rossing's attention to them. Second, the centrality of the concept of Kairos in Dr. Rossing's talk stresses the importance of recognizing that there is an understanding of this moment that exceeds our own. That is, the meaning of the time we are in, or of any time, is not necessarily what most people take it to be, or the interpretation that is most prominent culturally. Where empire incoherently presents this time as a moment of both unstoppable collapse and unnecessary panic, that fuller apocalyptic understanding perceives this as a moment of Kairos. This time calls neither for desperation nor opportunism, but attention and decisive action. In the interest of engaging in the work of saying, yes, it is late, but it is not too late, I propose 3 conceptual shifts that could help churches respond to this Kairos moment. A shift from a human-centered narrative to a planet-centered narrative, a shift from guilt to grace, and a shift from human dominance to human dependence. The most like academic talk I'm giving is being treated as a sermon in the room. It's wonderful. First, the shift from a human-centered narrative to a planet-centered narrative. Too often, we place humans at the center of our climate change story. We frame ourselves as responsible for the rest of creation, capable of destroying the planet, and in danger of letting this Kairos moment slip by. I suggest that we instead center the planet. Far from letting this moment slip by, the planet is already changing as life adapts in whatever ways it can. Such change is indeed frustrated to the extent that humanity is captured by empire, but it is already underway. This is absolutely human-created climate change, but to understand the fuller meaning of this moment, we need to contextualize human action within the broader creation of which it has only ever been one aspect. And in working to make the most of this Kairos moment, we are participating in a larger movement of creation, a movement of the spirit, the healing work of the entire planet. Second, the shift from guilt to grace. Assertions that it's too late are regularly tangled up with a second claim that it's all our fault. As Dr. Rossing pointed out, climate change and its devastating effects are not everyone's fault equally. Nonetheless, even those among us who should claim a fair degree of responsibility, feeling guilty about our role in climate change often simply deepens the sense that it's too late and that we of all creatures have no capacity to do anything to help. Intervening in this debilitating feedback loop, churches can witness to the reality of grace, offering an invitation to repent, let go of that which is destroying us, and embrace the possibility of living otherwise, responding to God's grace by finding new ways and reclaiming old ways as needed, which I think that the last presentation was all about 50 different ways that that's going on. Third, in conversation with Ivone Gabarra's Longing for Running Water and Sally McFaig's The Body of God, I propose a shift from human dominance to human dependence. Empire offers us a seductive portrait of creation in which humanity stands on top, capable of determining the fate of creatures great and small. To the extent that climate change is acknowledged and a call to action is heeded, Empire would have us ground that action in the confidence that there is no challenge human brilliance cannot overcome, no system we cannot unravel and bend to our will, which I think Dr. Rossing was getting at in terms of these wild, technological solutions coming up with all kinds of new ways to transform the planet for our benefit. Humans are, of course, entirely dependent on all of those creatures that Empire so easily deems inferior. Lakes and mud, worms and kelp, grass and gut bacteria. My student, Katie, would certainly mention mushrooms. We are dependent on all of them for our continued survival. So following the kenotic, that is self-emptying movement of Christ from the mode of divinity we most readily mistake for dominance to a mode of divinity as absolute, unrestrained infant dependence, I suggest that we might reject that great imperial chain of being and allow ourselves to be diminished, or rather, to allow our self-perception to settle down to the humble level of our animal bodies that God called good. It's late, but not too late, to respond to God's grace with repentance, reclaiming the place of dependence for which we have been blessedly made, and participating in the planet's work of healing. Thanks.
I'd like to focus on what Barbara has done to build the biblical basis for action. Barbara has given us one of the strongest biblical images that the world matters and that it's part of God's plan for our future. That's the vision of the New Jerusalem descending from heaven at the end of the book of Revelation. At the end of time, when all will be resolved, we will not leave the earth. The New Jerusalem will descend to earth, and God will take up residence
and dwell with us. This is an earth-centered vision. It's rapture in reverse. Our earth becomes the locus of redemption and the place of God's eternal role. The whole message of the Bible, Barbara writes, is that God loves the world so much that God comes to the earth to dwell with us. I want to point out how radical this is, how opposite it is to our usual theology of going to heaven to live with God. It drastically centers the earth in God's plan. It suddenly makes the earth matter. If this were all Barbara had done for us, it would be enough. We find the same earth-centered approach to the world in the Old Testament. Contrary to the salvation history approach of the 20th century, which saw the world of nature as secondary to human experience, the world is central to Old Testament writers. Everywhere and always, Old Testament writers take their agricultural landscape as the center of the world, the material out of which they were made, the object of their vocation as farmers, the origin of the seasons of their religious calendar, and the medium by which God appeared to them, primarily in the thunderstorm. The Bible's God is not the God of classical theism, separate from creation, the transcendent God. Old Testament writers did not split the world into two worlds with its binaries, the material and the spiritual, the natural and the supernatural, the secular and the sacred. They described an immanent God. The God Marshall Salins, over here from the University of Chicago. The God Marshall Salins describes in The New Science of the Enchanted Universe, an anthropology of most of humanity. This God not only creates the world, but animates it by indwelling it and inspiriting it. In this enchanted universe, everything is full of and is motivated by God. Barbara herself talks about the world full of God's life and spirit in the New Testament, where animals have souls and the whole cosmos sings its praise. We have a Bible that has a worldview up to the challenge that Barbara describes, but it has been weakened by anthropocentric assumptions and by classical theism that has divided the world between spirit and matter. These assumptions and this theism must be abandoned. The earth at the center must be retrieved, and the God who inspirits the world must be found again. It's that kind of a Kairos moment. Some years ago, while designing a class on religious leadership for an ecological age with Claire Butterfield, then the director of Faith in Place, I, the biblical scholar, argued that we should begin with the environmental crisis and then bring the Bible to bear on it. Claire, the practitioner, proposed the opposite. We should begin with the Bible, because if it valued the world as we said it did, we should be living by it whether we were facing a crisis or not. She was right, of course. But then as the class went on, we learned something else about the power of the Bible. As we became overwhelmed by the size of the crisis, and as we began to deal with the emotions of despair and helplessness, we discovered an unanticipated benefit in grounding our course in the sources of our faith. We found that biblical values and their vision for a flourishing world gave us the anchor and foundation we needed for not giving up. Biblical values gave us a reason for faithfulness, even when things looked impossibly bleak. And Barbara's interpretation of the New Jerusalem in her book was one of those biblical authors. I'd like to close with a thought about hope and perseverance against all odds. These are the emotions we're left with after all of this information. But there is something we can do. We must be able to imagine what the future could look like to have hope. And Barbara offers us a way to do this at the end of her book. She asks us to name our city and then rephrase the vision of the New Jerusalem in terms of our own city's renewal. I saw the holy city, God's new Chicago, coming down out of heaven. What would our new city look like? How would it be the renewal of creation that God intends? What would it require of us? That's the question Barbara leaves us with.
My first wow, I'd like to add 3 more. Wow, wow, wow. Thank you so much. I have to confess, usually I'm rather bored by panels. And I always kind of hesitate, panels. This was fantastic. Really, thank you so much, all 3 of you. I really so much appreciate it. What a lively evening we have had. Thank you so much. I'm going to now call up Roger Schrader, and he is going to lead us in questions and answers.
Okay, so we have some time now for some Q&A. Those who are on Zoom, I invite you to put your questions in the chat. I should have mentioned this earlier, but anyways, I'm sure you can type quickly. So if you can do that, and Mark Swanson will be the one who will be bringing some of those questions from the Zoom participants. So for all of us to participate, but maybe we start here in terms of those in the room who are here who would have any questions. Peter, do we have people with microphones? Okay, I see. We've got people here with microphones to go around. So who would like to bring a question either to Barbara? Maybe we start there, but any of the panelists, of course. Particular questions? Okay, I see one back there, Fatanora.
Hi, good afternoon, or good evening. So as I heard you, Dr. Barbara, speaking, I had got the sense that what we hear as the centrality of the Christian understanding of hope is not hope as the concept or the cause of action, but somehow the cause as a consequence of action. And as I hear, maybe I'm wrong in kind of understanding, in kind of hearing it this way. I wanted to ask now, from that standpoint, what is the relationship? And this is a question not just for you, but I think this is something that all the panelists also kind of share. What is then the role and the nature of the political, the economic, and the religious? And maybe what are now the categories that can be mobilized, but also kind of used as maybe elements for action in that sense. So the political, the economic, and also the religious, how do they actually contribute or intersect to create more or less a more hopeful, but hope that is actually a consequence of action, not really the cause of action?
Well, I think we need all. I have the microphone. All, and they're all related. Thank you so much. That's a great question, but obviously the Bible is very political, it's very economic, and it's also religious. So all of these together are needed at this moment in our time. Yeah. You're right. You're exactly right.
Okay. All right. Someone else want to? It's not necessary for each to respond. Maybe just.
I just wanted to include the arts. I mean, you mentioned stories, but I think, and to your point, or all our points. you know, it's, even as you were speaking, I had this sense to both want to cry because of the grief, but also because of the hope that you engendered. So I think the emotional wisdom is needed to move through even the struggle to enter into and do these things. And I think the arts and stories help us do that.
I'm not going to insist on speaking to everything, but I think a great deal about hope, and the sort of political aspects of hope. A thinker that I draw on a lot in relation to hope is Fred Moten, who talks about Blackness as this kind of unlivable reality in the kind of racial world that we live in, and that's precisely where hope can be found, right? Because that's what can't be captured by white supremacy, by empire, is that place where it seems like life isn't possible, and yet life is found. And I think in the idea of there's already another world, right? Those spaces where people are already kind of living in different ways, even when we're being told it's not possible to do so, are exactly where hope can be found, that you don't have to imagine, although I love that image of imagine what would your city be like in this, new Chicago coming down. But we don't have to go that far even to find hope. We can look at the spaces exactly where we're told it's not possible to have hope and see where life is persisting there.
All right, thank you. I think there was a
And go
question.
outside every day.
Oh.
How's that? I just thought of that. You mentioned political, economic, and religious. I would say the natural as well. It's so important to me to go outside, to go to Lake Michigan every day and see something unexpected in God's nature.
Good, thank you. All right, there was a question here. Oh, you get the microphone?
I have it, yeah.
Okay, good.
Professor Drossing and maybe Joy, with regards to non-human personhood, corporations have CEOs and boards of directors. How does that work with the natural world? Who speaks for a river, and how would we prevent Exxon from buying that river and speaking on behalf of that river? And I don't know, Professor Joy, if you have any insights from Latin America, how that might have worked out.
I think about it.
That's a really good question. Does anybody know from New Zealand? I mean, I think it really works. The parliament then grants the indigenous communities, I believe, rights to represent the river. So long as, and then I think in Ecuador, it's an indigenous community as well that can represent it, but probably ideally, it would be better if corporations did not have persons, but that's the direction I prefer to go. But I think, yeah, it's interesting. There was this famous article, "Who speaks for the river?" And this question is taken up, but it's a good question. It's just that the communities can be delegated as the ones who do it.
I think, let Ruko, Joanne.
So in the indigenous worldview is they are listening to the land, or they're learning from the land, or they're being guided by the land or the earth. I mean, the earth is like everything, not just the dirt. So their collective responses to how to respond to her. I think within that context, so to put it in a legal realm, it's like you're beginning to shift context. I mean, I don't know. That's why I had a hard time trying to respond, because you kind of mixed a couple of contexts together. But they would naturally, even their sensitivity to climate change happening in their midst, and they can't read the same signs they could from before to know when to plant. So they're speaking up about that, saying.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the question, Mark, are you ready with some questions, sir, too? So maybe we'll take one more. Why don't you go ahead? Why don't we go to Zoom now? So Mark, you have a question for us? You need some microphone?
Thank you. I have a question from a student coming in from Texas right now. There's a comment about the role of globalization and its role in the changes that have taken place because of development throughout the world. But then there's a very specific question. What are your recommendations to upcoming ministers for preaching? Do you have a remark about, how should future preachers be thinking about preaching?
Wow. Really. Well, so if you're gonna preach on the lectionary, I think Roman Catholics, Lutherans, Presbyterians follow a sort of cycle. Then Revelation comes up in year C with 6 Sundays. So that's really a chance to talk about this book in a sustained way, that it's not about getting raptured off the earth. It's not about Christian nationalism. It's not about some of these terrible political ideas, but it's about God's love for the earth. I think it is really important to preach hope, because I think most people come to church kind of beaten down by despair and anxiety and fear. So I guess community mobilization would be another thing, that you can't do it alone. Nobody can address climate change alone. We have to organize, we have to get together. So help form community. I like to use Brian Blunt's image of kind of pocket eschatology, that you don't change the whole world, but you can be a pocket of change, a pocket of living differently, and help your community do that. But I would definitely agree with Marvin. The goal is not to inspire guilt. I mean, it's grace. It's really, really grace. Thank you to all of you.
I find that ironically, one of the signs of hope is that Texas has the most renewable energy of any state. A third of the energy of Texas is renewable. So that's kind of ironic. It's kind of hope coming where you would least expect it.
Anyone else?
I guess on the question of preaching, I want to lift up Dr. Hubert's comments about all of the places in the Bible where non-human creatures are making their presence known, where they're speaking, where they're acting, and in exegeting a text, you can look for those voices first instead of going straight to like, who's the main character of this story, who's the hero, who is our model, and instead look for the ways that creation is already kind of acting and present and center them.
Okay. All right, thank you. Okay, I think we had a question here, then Mark will go back to you. Okay.
So it's kind of a common following the personhood but also for the question that go to a forest and let a tree preach to you. Meet in a space and don't talk, just listen. That's what new ministers should start thinking about. Like, don't identify yourself with Israel, because sometimes we might be Egypt. So that's what we need to start thinking about. But regarding personhood and nature, part of, for me, that is interesting is that we are trying, and we've been talking about indigenous knowledge, but we're trying to use indigenous knowledge and and convert it kind of into Western cosmology. But we are not willing to do the opposite. Because when we say, oh, nature as personhood, the thing is, personhood is a very Western, it's a very colonial cosmovision. The nation state is a very Western and colonial cosmovision. That is not how indigenous understand themselves. And that's not how indigenous people understand nature. Because it's not about them having personhood. It's that we are also nature. It's that we are together. So maybe instead of thinking about personhood, we need to just start changing our cosmology, our way of thinking, our way of organizing states and because it's not making nature human, but it's making human less human.
Okay, thank you. Okay, good, good. Any comments here or response from the panel? Okay, good. I think that was an affirmation. Yes, amen. Did the church say amen? Okay. Mark, do you have any other question? No other questions, sir? Okay. Any other question? Here we do. Yeah. The microphone. Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to go back to the concern about politics. Because nowadays, we're talking about the fact that theology takes place in the public arena, not just well, in a particular way. And my question is then, what type of practice of our we're calling our communities to foster or to promote in the context of witnessing to the gospel. Of course, being in the public arena today is a very complex issue. Given the way that falsehoodness takes place in the political discourse. So the question would be, what's the alternative? And how do we move forward? Because the game has changed, the rules are changed. I know that people like James C. Scott is very helpful when he talks about the weapons of the weak in the context of power, but in the context of our public arena, what's the role of ministry?
Barbara, people are looking at you.
Thank you. And Jose, we were at Standing Rock together. I mean, it's, what is the role of ministry? We have to, be allies of communities that are really, really working, for love and justice and, you're my elder, you know better than I do.
I'll redirect to the, it was the slide on the just roots, right? I mean, I think it's, if the public is changing, then ministry has to change, right? So what's the role of ministry? It follows from what is the world becoming, right? And I think that was a really good example of what ministry can be. That's maybe not like having like a super loud public voice all the time, but having a very steady public presence in a community space and transforming it and making it something that where the community thrives. I think that's like a really good example of what ministry can be as the public changes.
Good. Okay.
Good. The garden.
Yeah, the garden image. Okay, maybe we have time for one more question. I see there's one, I know there's a couple hands here. Depends how long the questions and answers are.
Maybe not too long. My question just has to do with hope, as you've brought up so wonderfully. And what would you suggest are maybe the virtues that need to be animated by that hope in order to bring about the change that seems to be needed And then maybe bringing that back into the world mission emphasis. How can those who are kind of coming as outsiders and guests animate that hope and those virtues?
Well, it is such an important question. As I was driving to the airport, I was listening to a podcast by Rebecca Solnit. And she and so many others, another whose book on hope is really important would be Alan Bozak, who's he often quotes that St. Augustine quote that actually nobody can find, to my knowledge, but hope has two beautiful daughters. They are anger and courage. And it's a great quote. We hope he said it. But what Rebecca Solnit will say, you can't just, it's not the same as optimism, of course, because you don't know if you're going to succeed. But what she underscores so much is sometimes successes happen indirectly, unexpectedly. She asks rhetorically, you can't just have hope and take action because you know you're going to succeed. It'd be ridiculous. It's like saying, are you never going to go on a date if you don't know you're going to succeed? Are you never going to have children? I mean, you don't know the outcome, but you have to just go forward in hope. So it's, I really would recommend that book, Not Too Late. I think the essays in there are a really fine collection. My colleague Ben Stewart used it in his class at Holden Village this January term. I think some of you were in there, and it's, it's just looking for pockets of hope, of action that are signs of hope, and globally. So many of the authors in this book are from the global south. It's really important. But I think, the example of Greta Thunberg, she just started her Fridays school strikes, having no idea what it would do, but it's, really been game changing in so many ways. So you never know the outcome, but you have to act because God tells us that we need to be faithful.
One of the classes that I taught on this topic, we did field trips. And
I did field trips. Southeast.
So these field trips were to different places in Chicago where stuff was happening. And it was amazing how you could see in these initiatives, whether it's a community project or a urban farm or these kind of things, at the end of the day, to see the stories, I don't know, it was a very hopeful thing. And I guess we could talk a lot, we could explain a lot, but it was like seeing people doing stuff that was most inspiring.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right. So I think we're gonna have to stop here. I know there's more questions and that, yeah, I know there's more questions, but I think we need to move more towards the end. So let's give again applause to ourselves and to the executives here. So at this time, I'd like to invite President here at CTU, Dr. Barbara Reed, to come forward and offer a few comments, closing comments for our event tonight.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you all. What an unenviable task to have to bring this to an end. We began with recognizing the giant shoulders on which we stand, Dr. Jim Scherer and Dr. Jack Boberg, and so many others over the last 6 decades, going on 6 decades now, who have built this wonderful partnership and among our 3 schools and invited in other friends beyond our schools. Tonight we have almost 200 people here. We have 82 in person and there are 110 online. So from each of our 3 schools, and then there are about 40 some others that are friends and acquaintances that have joined us. So I find even that is such an image of hope, like a pebble that's dropped into the lake and the ripples just keep expanding farther and farther.
I, I was wondering when you started out, Barbara, I thought, oh, I don't need anything depressing tonight, because we all know what desperate shape we are in. But I just loved your emphasis on the hope that it is not too late. And if we have the will and finding that possibility in the place of Kairos, I loved, of course, as a biblical scholar, that that all of you grounded your work in scripture, especially Barbara and Ted. And I was thinking how to go as you were sharing about indigenous peoples who are so one with Earth. How do you get there? And I was thinking about your 3 shifts, Marvin. How do we make those shifts? What is the kind of transformation that will move us to action? And Ted, I think the key was when you talked about how God loves the earth so much. And I started thinking about maybe that's the Lenten next step of conversion, at least for me. How much do I care about Earth because of what Earth does for me and what I get from Earth? So I care if Earth is dying because it's going to wreck my summer, because the weather isn't the way I like it in the summertime, or in a more serious way, the way that we depend on Earth for so much of life. But what if I loved Earth in se? What if I loved Earth because Earth is Earth and deserving of that love that God so passionately has for Earth? And so that's what I'm left with, is a prayer for that kind of deeper transformation toward love for Earth that is so passionate that then that is what motivates me to take the actions that you have been encouraging us are possible. And I'd like to close with a poem, a prayer by Joyce Rupp, who reminds us how possible it is to have that oneness with Earth, that love of Earth that God has of Earth. And this comes from the collection, The Cosmic Dance. So I invite you to pray, reflect on this poem prayer with me. It is possible to become one with Earth. It is possible to become so one with Earth that every flower perfumes the soul. Every snowflake sends icy softness dancing through veins. Every drop of rain trickles down vessels of the heart. Every cloud in the sky sails along song lines of the spirit. Every earthquake rumbles in the gut. Every tide of the sea moves in and out of self. It is possible to become one with Earth, just as it is possible to become one with all people. Their pain, my pain, their joy, my joy, their struggle and delight, the echo of my own. It is possible to become one. It is possible. And I would add, which she doesn't have as her closing,